That human is my husband." The words would echo across a command deck full of alien royalty 3 days later. But at that moment, Ethan Carter was just a tired communications technician lying on his back under a half-open transmitter panel with a wrench in one hand and a flashlight balanced between his teeth. The relay station orbited a quiet blue dwarf star nearly 400 million miles from the nearest colony, the kind of lonely outpost where equipment hummed louder than conversation, and the highlight of the week was a fresh diagnostic report. The transmitter above him crackled softly as he tightened a bolt, warm metal vibrating against his knuckles while ion winds from the nearby star brushed the station hull like distant surf. Ethan spit the flashlight into his palm and squinted up at the tangled circuits. "You'd think," he muttered to the machine, "an interstellar alliance with 1,000 planets could design a relay that doesn't overheat every 6 months." The panel responded with a polite beep as if offended. Ethan wiped grease on his work shirt and reached for a fiber cable when every light in the room dimmed for half a second. The transmitter paused, recalibrating. The station's sensors chimed once. Then again. Then the entire control wall lit up with a cascade of alerts. Ethan rolled out from beneath the transmitter and sat up slowly. Outside the observation window, the empty starfield was no longer empty. A formation of massive ships slid into orbit like dark mountains drifting across space, their hulls glowing faint gold in the starlight. Ethan blinked. "Well," he said quietly, "that's new." According to the registry codes flashing across the console, those ships didn't belong to the Alliance Patrol or any commercial fleet. They belonged to the Eryxian Empire, royal vessels, the kind that normally stayed hundreds of light years away from maintenance stations run by underpaid humans with tool belts. Ethan stood and brushed metal dust from his jeans while the transmitter continued to hum behind him. Outside, one of the ships rotated slowly until its polished hull reflected the blue star like liquid glass. A moment later, a shuttle detached from its side and began descending toward the station. Ethan checked the transmitter again out of habit. Still broken. Still half repaired. Still open. "Great timing," he murmured. The airlock alarm chimed softly down the corridor. Visitors. Important ones. Ethan picked up his wrench again and slid halfway back under the transmitter panel. If someone important was arriving, the last thing he needed was a broken communication array making him look incompetent. He twisted the cable into place just as the control room doors opened behind him and unfamiliar footsteps crossed the metal floor. Tall footsteps. Measured. Calm. Ethan kept working. Sparks flickered once as the transmitter restarted, its signal strength climbing steadily on the screen above him. Someone stopped a few feet away and watched. Ethan felt the presence before he saw it. He leaned back out from beneath the transmitter, wiping his hands on a cloth as he looked up, and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure taller than any human in the room, skin the color of turquoise glass catching the station lights, eyes bright and curious as she studied the open transmitter and the human technician sitting beneath it like a mechanic under an old pickup truck. Ethan blinked once. He said, holding up the wrench. "Give me about 2 more minutes, and your signal network should be back online." The woman in the doorway did not answer immediately. The room had gone strangely quiet except for the steady hum of the transmitter stabilizing behind Ethan. The console lights reflected softly across the polished surface of her turquoise skin, giving it a faint glow like sunlight passing through shallow ocean water. Several figures stood behind her, tall armored officers with silver crests along their shoulders, but none of them moved. Their attention was locked entirely on the human kneeling on the floor beside an open communications core. Ethan realized 2 things at the same time. First, the woman in front of him was not simply an officer. The subtle crown-like structure woven into the silver metal of her collar marked her status, clearly even to someone who did not know alien royal customs. Second, the transmitter he had been repairing belonged to her fleet. Ethan slowly lowered the wrench so it did not look like he was holding a weapon, although it was just a tool from the maintenance rack. He cleared his throat. Communications relay 4.7 was overheating, he explained carefully, pointing toward the open panel. Signal routing coil burned out sometime this morning. I replaced the fiber conduit and recalibrated the phase timing. It should stabilize the long range. Signal. One of the officers stepped forward sharply. Human technician, the officer said, voice smooth and controlled through a translator field. Step away from the Imperial transmitter immediately. Ethan blinked once and leaned back on his hands. I can, he replied calmly. But if I do it right now, your fleet will lose about 30% of its signal strength until the replacement coil finishes sinking. The officer hesitated. The woman in front did not. She stepped forward instead. The movement was slow and deliberate, her long cloak whispering softly across the metal floor. When she stopped beside the open transmitter panel, she looked down at the circuitry, then at Ethan, then back at the screen displaying the signal calibration numbers. Ethan followed her gaze and watched the percentage climb. 52, 68, 79. The transmitter gave a soft confirmation tone. The Queen's golden eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. You repaired an Oryxian communication lattice, she said, her voice deep and composed. The translator rendered her words with a faint musical tone. Ethan shrugged slightly. Broken machines do not care who fixes them. The numbers reached 100%. A clean signal wave rolled across the console display. The room filled with a quiet series of confirmation chimes as the fleet outside reconnected to the station's relay network. Behind the Queen, several officers exchanged surprised glances. Ethan wiped his hands with the cloth again and pushed himself to his feet. He stood about a foot shorter than the alien ruler in front of him, which made the situation feel even more unusual. There you go, he said simply. Network is stable again. For a moment the Queen did not respond. She studied the transmitter, then the human technician, then the tool still in his hand. Finally she tilted her head slightly. Human, she said, what is your name? Ethan shifted his weight and offered a small polite nod, the same one he used when speaking to Alliance supervisors. Ethan Carter, he replied. Communications maintenance engineer. The Queen repeated the name slowly, as if testing the sound of it. Ethan Carter. Something thoughtful flickered across her expression while the control room remained completely silent around them. Then she looked back at the transmitter, at the flawless signal now moving through it, and said quietly, It appears you have just restored communication for an entire royal fleet. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and gave a small, uncertain smile. Honestly, he said, I was just trying to fix a broken transmitter. The quiet that followed Ethan's answer stretched just long enough to make the control room feel smaller. Outside the observation window, the royal fleet drifted in perfect formation around the blue dwarf star, their hulls reflecting the pale light like floating mirrors. Inside the room, every console now displayed stable signal waves flowing smoothly through the transmitter Ethan had repaired. The Queen studied those readings for several seconds before shifting her attention back to the human standing beside the open panel. Ethan Carter did not look particularly impressive. His work shirt was smudged with machine grease, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a small wrench still rested loosely in his hand. Yet the transmitter behind him continued to hum with flawless precision, carrying communications for vessels that stretched hundreds of miles through orbit. One of the armored officers cleared his throat. Your Majesty, he said carefully, Oryxian systems require specialized calibration. A human should not have been capable of repairing the lattice. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. The Queen lifted a single hand, and the officer immediately fell silent again. She stepped closer to the transmitter and leaned slightly to observe the circuitry. Her movements were calm and deliberate, the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding fleets far larger than the station around them. The relay frequency has stabilized, she said slowly, her voice thoughtful. Signal integrity is perfect. Ethan shrugged. It just needed a new timing alignment. Whoever installed the original conduit miscalculated the thermal drift by about 3 microseconds. The Queen glanced at him again, curiosity bright in her golden eyes. You diagnosed that in minutes. Ethan rested the wrench against his shoulder. When you maintain machines long enough, he said, they start to tell you what is wrong. A faint ripple of conversation moved through the officers behind her. One of them quietly checked the diagnostic panel again, as if expecting the transmitter to fail. It did not. The signal remained perfectly stable. The Queen straightened slowly and folded her hands behind her back. Ethan Carter, she said again, speaking his name more comfortably now. How long have you served on this station? About 11 months, he replied. Before that I worked maintenance on a cargo relay near Jupiter. The Queen tilted her head slightly. You repaired an Imperial communication lattice using only basic tools. Ethan glanced at the wrench and then at the transmitter. Well, he said with a small smile. A better toolbox would not have hurt. For a brief moment something unexpected happened. The Queen laughed softly. It was not loud, but the sound carried through the silent control room with surprising warmth. Several officers looked genuinely startled. Ethan blinked once, unsure whether he had just said something inappropriate to the ruler of an alien empire. The Queen's expression settled again, though the hint of amusement remained in her eyes. She turned toward the window where the fleet waited patiently in orbit. Our long-range channels were disrupted before arriving here, she said. Without the relay, we would have lost contact with half of our ships. Ethan followed her gaze toward the massive vessels drifting across the starfield. That would have been inconvenient, he said. She looked back at him once more, studying him in the quiet way a scientist might examine a strange discovery. You described the restoration of an entire fleet's communication network as inconvenient. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again. I mostly just fix things when they break. The Queen considered that answer for several seconds. Then she said calmly, You may have done much more than that. The transmitter continued to hum steadily behind Ethan Carter, its signal waves flowing across the console displays like calm water after a storm. For a maintenance engineer who spent most of his days alone with tools and malfunction reports, the control room suddenly felt unusually crowded. Half a dozen Oryxian officers stood in disciplined silence near the entrance while their queen remained only a few feet away, studying both the repaired machine and the human who had fixed it. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and placed the wrench back onto the tool tray beside the open panel. The metal clicked softly against the tray, and the sound seemed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Outside the observation window, the enormous fleet remained motionless in orbit, hundreds of miles of polished hulls reflecting the blue star like drifting mirrors. Ethan had never seen ships that large this close before. One of them alone was easily 2 miles long, its layered structure glowing faintly with internal power. Compared to that, the maintenance station felt about the size of a gas station rest stop floating in space. The Queen slowly walked past Ethan and stopped beside the observation window. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass as she looked out at the fleet. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the soft rhythm of the transmitter carrying signals across millions of miles of empty space. Finally, she said, Before arriving here, our fleet lost contact with several forward vessels beyond the outer relay line. Ethan followed her gaze toward the distant ships. Interference from the dwarf star, he said automatically. Ion radiation can scramble phase channels if the relay timing drifts even a little. One of the officers turned toward him immediately. That is exactly what our engineers concluded, the officer said. Ethan gave a small shrug. Physics works the same for everyone. The Queen turned back toward him, her expression thoughtful again. Our engineers attempted remote repair for several hours. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at the transmitter panel. Sometimes remote fixes do not work, he said. Machines usually behave better when someone actually opens the panel and talks to them. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the officers again. The Queen's eyes remained on him, curious but calm. You speak to machines. Ethan nodded casually. Mostly encouragement, he said. Occasionally mild criticism. For a brief moment the corner of the Queen's mouth lifted again in the same small, amused expression as before. Then her attention shifted to the console displaying fleet communication traffic. Dozens of signals now flowed smoothly through the relay, reconnecting ships that had been silent for hours. Data pulses moved across the screen like streams of light traveling across space. She placed one hand lightly on the console edge and watched the restored network operate for several seconds. Your repair has reconnected every vessel in this formation, she said quietly. Ethan glanced at the screen and then back at her. Looks that way. Another officer stepped forward carefully. Your Majesty, the Fleet Command reports that navigation coordination is fully restored. The Queen nodded once, but did not take her eyes off Ethan. And all of this occurred because a human maintenance engineer happened to be repairing a transmitter. Ethan spread his hands slightly. That was the plan for today. The Queen studied him for another long moment, the quiet of the control room settling around them again. Then she said calmly, Ethan Carter, I believe your day is about to become far more interesting than you expected. For a moment, Ethan Carter thought she was joking. Maintenance engineers did not usually become involved in Royal Fleet operations. His job description mostly included replacing worn circuits, recalibrating signal coils, and occasionally convincing stubborn machines to start working again. Yet the way the Queen studied him suggested she was not speaking casually. The control room lights reflected across the polished metal surfaces around them, while the transmitter continued its steady hum behind his shoulder, quietly routing signals between ships spread across hundreds of miles of orbit. Ethan glanced at the main display again. Dozens of communication lines now flowed smoothly through the relay network, each signal representing a massive vessel outside the station window. It still felt strange to think that one loose timing coil had been enough to interrupt contact between ships larger than entire cities. The Queen slowly walked back toward the transmitter panel and looked down at the open circuitry once more. "Our engineers will want to examine this repair," she said. Ethan stepped aside so she could see the panel more clearly. "It is not complicated," he explained. "The relay timing unit overheated and drifted out of alignment. I replaced the fiber conduit and recalibrated the phase offset by 3 microseconds." One of the officers behind her frowned slightly. "Oryxian transmitters are designed with redundant stabilization fields," the officer said. Ethan nodded. "Yes, but the backup system was compensating instead of correcting. That made the drift worse over time." The officer opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused while studying the diagnostic data again. The numbers on the screen confirmed Ethan's explanation exactly. The Queen looked between the officer and the transmitter panel with quiet interest. "You identified this within minutes." Ethan gave another small shrug. Broken machines tend to repeat the same mistakes. The Queen straightened and turned toward the large observation window again. Outside, the fleet formation slowly shifted as several ships adjusted position now that their navigation channels were fully synchronized again. The movement was graceful and controlled, like enormous birds gliding through silent space. Ethan folded his arms loosely and watched them for a moment. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "that ship on the left is about 2 miles long." One of the officers replied immediately. 2.3 miles. Ethan whistled softly. "That is a lot of ship." The Queen glanced back at him again, the hint of amusement returning briefly to her expression. "The Oryxian Empire builds vessels meant to last centuries." Ethan nodded. "Good idea." He gestured toward the transmitter behind him. "The smaller machines are usually the ones that cause trouble." The Queen studied him for another quiet moment before speaking again. "Ethan Carter, this station lies at a critical point between several communication routes." Ethan nodded again. "Yes. It connects relay traffic between the outer mining colonies and the Central Alliance networks. And yet only one human technician maintains the entire system." Ethan looked around the room as if expecting to see someone else. "That would be me." The Queen considered that answer carefully. Her gaze returned to the steady transmitter signal flowing across the display. "A single individual restored communication for an entire fleet," she said quietly. Ethan shifted slightly, unsure why the observation felt important. Finally he said, "Honestly, Your Majesty, I was just doing routine maintenance." The Queen's golden eyes rested on him again, thoughtful and calm. "Yes," she replied softly. "That is precisely what interests me." The control room lights glowed softly while the repaired transmitter continued to route signals through the station like a steady heartbeat. Ethan Carter leaned against the edge of the console, watching the data streams move across the display in smooth lines of light. Each signal represented a ship somewhere outside the station, some of them more than 2 miles long and filled with thousands of crew members who depended on the quiet machine humming beside him. It felt strange to think that a few minutes earlier those ships had been partially blind to one another. Now their communication channels flowed perfectly again, bouncing through the relay Ethan had repaired with a wrench and a spare fiber conduit. Across the room, the Oryxian Queen remained still beside the observation window, her turquoise reflection shimmering faintly in the glass as she studied the slow movement of her fleet. Several vessels were adjusting formation now that their coordination signals were synchronized again, gliding through orbit with graceful precision. The silence in the room felt different now, less tense than before, but still filled with a quiet sense of curiosity. Directed entirely at the human maintenance engineer. One of the officers finally stepped closer to the console and reviewed the diagnostic panel again. Signal stability remains perfect, the officer said. Ethan nodded casually. The replacement coil should hold for at least a few years if no one spills coffee on the panel. The officer turned his head slightly. Coffee. Ethan waved a hand. Human problem. The Queen glanced back at him again, the faint trace of amusement returning to her expression. She stepped away from the window and approached the transmitter once more, her movements calm and unhurried. When she stopped beside Ethan, she studied the open panel again, as if committing every detail to memory. You performed this repair alone, she said. Ethan nodded. This station usually only has one technician on duty. The Queen looked around the control room briefly. The quiet consoles, the racks of tools, the simple maintenance chair beside the transmitter. Everything about the station suggested routine work performed far from the attention of empires and fleets. And you maintain this entire relay network by yourself, she said. Ethan shrugged slightly. Most days it just runs quietly. One of the officers behind her spoke again. Your Majesty, the Fleet Command reports full restoration of navigation synchronization and deep channel communications. The Queen nodded slowly, though her attention remained on Ethan. Then the stability of an entire fleet currently depends on a repair performed by a single human technician. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again. When you say it like that, it sounds a little dramatic. The Queen regarded him for a moment before responding. From our perspective, it is. Ethan glanced toward the observation window again. Outside, the ships continued their quiet movement around the blue star, their signals passing through the transmitter behind him in steady pulses. For the first time since the fleet had arrived, he realized something unusual. The Queen had not asked him to leave the control room. She had not ordered her officers to take control of the transmitter either. Instead, she remained standing beside him, calmly observing the system he maintained. Ethan folded his arms loosely and looked at the signal display again. Well, he said thoughtfully, as long as the relay holds, everyone can talk to each other again. The Queen watched the flowing signals for several seconds before speaking. Communication, she said quietly, is the foundation of every civilization. Ethan nodded. That is why broken transmitters make people nervous. The Queen turned her gaze back toward him, her golden eyes thoughtful again. Ethan Carter, she said slowly, I believe we should continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable than a maintenance station control room. Ethan blinked once. That sounds like the beginning of an interesting afternoon. The Queen studied him for another quiet moment before replying. Yes. I suspect it will be. The control room remained quiet for several seconds after the Queen spoke. Ethan Carter looked from the transmitter to the tall alien ruler standing beside him and tried to process the situation with the calm practicality that had always helped him solve mechanical problems. Machines were predictable. People were not. Alien queens with fleets large enough to eclipse half the sky were even less predictable. Outside the observation window, the blue dwarf star cast a soft glow across the drifting formation of Eryxian vessels, their massive hulls gliding slowly through orbit like patient giants. Ethan folded his arms loosely and tilted his head toward the transmitter behind him. I should probably close that panel first, he said. Leaving equipment open makes maintenance reports look messy. The Queen watched as he crouched down again and carefully secured the transmitter housing, tightening the last set of bolts with the same steady movements he used for every repair. When the final screw clicked into place, the machine gave a quiet confirmation tone, its systems fully stabilized. Ethan stood again and wiped his hands with the cloth from his tool belt. All right, he said calmly. Now it officially counts as fixed. One of the Eryxian officers studied the transmitter as if expecting some hidden complication to appear. None did. The signal indicators remained perfectly steady. The Queen stepped toward the exit corridor and motioned slightly with one hand. Her officers immediately moved to follow her, their movements precise and silent. Ethan hesitated for a moment before picking up his tool case and walking after them. The corridor outside the control room felt strangely narrow after seeing the immense fleet through the observation window. Soft white lights ran along the curved walls of the station, reflecting off the polished armor of the Eryxian escort. Ethan walked beside the Queen, noticing that even her stride carried a quiet sense of balance and control, as if she had spent a lifetime moving through command decks and diplomatic halls rather than maintenance corridors filled with spare wiring. Your station is remarkably isolated, she said as they walked. Ethan nodded. 400 million miles from the nearest colony. That keeps the signal traffic clean, and it does not trouble you to live so far from others of your kind. Ethan considered the question for a moment. Machines are good company, he said lightly. They complain less. The Queen gave another small laugh, softer this time, as they approached the station's docking chamber. The airlock doors opened smoothly and revealed the waiting Orixian shuttle resting inside the bay. The craft was elegant and curved, its silver hull reflecting the station lights like polished glass. Ethan slowed slightly when he saw it. That is a very expensive ride for a conversation, he said. The Queen stopped beside the ramp and looked back at him. Ethan Carter, she replied calmly. The repair you performed has prevented a serious disruption to my fleet's coordination. I believe that deserves more than a conversation through a maintenance console. Ethan glanced once more toward the observation window at the distant ships and then back at the shuttle. For someone who normally spent his days adjusting signal coils and replacing worn cables, stepping onto a royal transport was not exactly routine maintenance. Still, the transmitter was stable and the station systems were quiet. He lifted his tool case slightly and nodded. Well, he said with a small smile, I suppose the relay can run itself for a little while. The Queen stepped onto the ramp first, her officers following behind her, and Ethan Carter found himself walking toward a royal shuttle with the same calm curiosity he usually reserved for malfunctioning machines. The interior of the Orixian shuttle felt nothing like the maintenance station Ethan Carter had just left behind. The ramp sealed quietly behind him, and the cabin lights shifted to a soft golden glow that reflected off curved silver walls and smooth crystal panels that hummed with quiet energy. The air itself smelled different, faintly clean and metallic, like the inside of a brand new machine. Ethan stepped a few feet inside and looked around with the calm curiosity he usually reserved for unfamiliar equipment. The shuttle's controls were arranged in a graceful arc around the forward viewing canopy, where the blue dwarf star burned brightly against the darkness of space. Outside, the massive fleet hung in orbit like a field of silent mountains. Ethan placed his tool case on the floor beside one of the passenger seats and folded his arms loosely while watching the view. You know, he said thoughtfully, my usual commute is about 20 feet from my bunk to the transmitter room. The Queen stood near the center of the cabin while the ramp sealed and the shuttle's engines began their quiet startup cycle. Your routine appears to have changed, she replied calmly. Ethan nodded once. That tends to happen when royal fleets show up unexpectedly. The shuttle lifted smoothly from the docking bay and drifted away from the small maintenance station that had been Ethan's entire world for nearly a year. Through the canopy, he could see the relay station shrinking slowly behind them, its small ring structure barely visible against the glow of the star. The transmitter he had repaired continued operating inside it, silently relaying signals between ships scattered across millions of miles. Ethan watched it disappear into the distance before turning his attention to the growing shape of the nearest Orixian vessel ahead of them. As the shuttle approached, the true scale of the ship became clearer. Its polished hull stretched for miles, layered with glowing channels of energy and towering antenna structures that reached hundreds of feet above the surface. Ethan let out a quiet breath. That ship is bigger than most cities on Earth. One of the Orixian officers seated near the cockpit turned slightly. The flagship measures 2.3 miles in length. Ethan nodded slowly. That is a lot of machine to maintain. The Queen moved closer to the forward window beside him, watching the approaching vessel with the calm familiarity of someone who had seen it countless times before. It has served my empire for more than a century, she said. Ethan studied the ship again, his engineer's mind automatically analyzing the antenna arrays, communication towers, and sensor rings spread across the hull. I am guessing the communication systems on that ship are a little more complicated than my transmitter. The Queen looked at him with a faint smile. Considerably. The shuttle glided toward a large illuminated docking port along the side of the flagship. Rows of lights guided their approach as the enormous bay doors opened slowly to receive them. Ethan shifted his weight and glanced at the Queen again. So, he said carefully, what exactly happens next for a maintenance engineer who accidentally repairs a royal fleet's communications network? The Queen studied him for a moment before answering. Her golden eyes reflected the lights of the docking bay as the shuttle began its final descent. Ethan Carter, she said calmly. I would like you to show my engineers exactly how you solved a problem they could not. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You brought me onto a 2-mile-long starship to explain a loose timing coil. The Queen's expression remained thoughtful as the shuttle settled gently into the docking bay. Yes, she said quietly. And I suspect that explanation will lead to many more questions. The shuttle settled into the docking bay with a smooth motion so gentle that Ethan Carter barely felt the landing. The forward canopy darkened slightly as the bright lights of the bay reflected across the glass. Outside, the interior of the massive flagship opened around them like the inside of a cathedral made of metal and light. Towering support columns stretched hundreds of feet overhead, and rows of glowing guidance lights ran along the polished deck, where dozens of smaller craft rested in silent formation. Ethan slowly stood from his seat and picked up his tool case again, watching the enormous structure with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood how much engineering it must have taken to build something this large. You could fit my entire relay station inside this docking bay, he said thoughtfully. One of the Oryxian officers near the cockpit responded calmly. Approximately 6 times. Ethan gave a small whistle under his breath. The ramp extended from the shuttle with a soft mechanical sound, and the air of the flagship flowed into the cabin. It felt cooler than the station air, faintly charged with the subtle vibration of massive power systems running somewhere deep inside the ship. The Queen stepped forward first, her long cloak moving softly behind her as she walked down the ramp and onto the polished deck. Her officers followed with practiced precision. Ethan adjusted the strap of his tool case and stepped down after them, his boots making a quiet echo against the metallic surface. The scale of the docking bay became even more impressive from the ground level. The ceiling seemed almost impossibly high, and the walls were lined with antenna arrays, communication towers, and signal relays that stretched upward like steel forests. Ethan tilted his head slightly while studying them. You have at least 300 communication towers just in this room, he said. One of the officers glanced upward as if counting. 312. Ethan nodded slowly. That explains the fleet coordination. The Queen walked ahead through the docking bay toward a wide corridor that led deeper into the flagship. Ethan followed beside her, his eyes still wandering across the surrounding structures. Every few seconds he noticed another piece of technology that would have taken years to design. Long relay conduits ran along the ceiling like glowing rivers of data, and sensor nodes flickered quietly as they processed signals from the fleet outside. The corridor beyond the bay opened into a massive interior chamber filled with consoles and holographic displays. Engineers and officers moved quietly between workstations, their movements efficient and calm. When the Queen entered the room, several of them paused immediately and bowed their heads slightly in respect. Ethan stopped near the entrance and looked around with genuine curiosity. The room felt less like a military command center and more like the nervous system of a living machine. Streams of light moved through holographic panels representing communication lines, navigation routes, and fleet positions spread across millions of miles of space. The Queen gestured toward one of the large central displays where several Oryxian engineers were studying a diagnostic feed. This, she said, is where our communications specialists attempted to solve the relay disruption. Ethan stepped closer to the display and examined the data scrolling across it. The diagnostic logs showed the same timing drift he had seen earlier in the station transmitter. He nodded slowly while reading the numbers. Yes, he said quietly. You were looking at the wrong part of the system. Several engineers turned toward him at once. One of them spoke carefully. Explain. Ethan set his tool case gently on the floor and stepped closer to the console. His eyes moved across the diagnostic readouts while the enormous flagship hummed quietly around them. The problem was not inside your ships, he said calmly. It was inside the relay timing alignment itself. The command chamber grew noticeably quieter after Ethan Carter spoke. The Oryxian engineers standing around the central console looked at one another briefly, then back at the human technician who had just suggested that the problem they had spent hours analyzing had never been inside the fleet systems at all. The massive flagship hummed steadily around them, its power systems flowing through thousands of conduits hidden behind the polished walls and towering antenna arrays above. Streams of communication data continued to pass through the holographic displays like rivers of light connecting every ship in the formation. Ethan stepped closer to the console and studied the diagnostic logs again, his eyes moving calmly through lines of data that most people in the room had already reviewed many times. "Your engineers focused on the fleet transmitters," he said, pointing toward the signal graphs floating in the air above the console. But those transmitters were not actually failing. One of the senior engineers folded his arms slightly. "The signal distortion was measured across multiple vessels," he said carefully. Ethan nodded. "Yes, because the relay they were using had already drifted out of alignment." The engineer frowned. "The relay network was inspected before your arrival." Ethan tilted his head slightly while examining the timing chart again. "Inspected remotely." Several of the engineers exchanged glances. The Queen remained silent beside him, watching with calm curiosity as the human technician traced a sequence of numbers across the display with one finger. "Your communication network uses phase-synchronized relay timing," Ethan continued. "When the relay station drifted out of alignment by a few microseconds, every signal that passed through it arrived slightly late." He tapped the console lightly, and one of the signal graphs expanded into a larger holographic projection. "Your ships tried to compensate by adjusting their transmitters." Another engineer nodded slowly. "That is standard protocol." Ethan smiled faintly. "It is also why the problem got worse." The room grew even quieter as several of the engineers studied the projection more closely. Ethan pointed toward the phase timing indicator drifting slowly across the chart. The more the fleet adjusted their transmitters, the further they moved away from the relay timing. The result looked like a fleet-wide communication fault. One of the younger engineers leaned closer to the display, but the relay station was not reporting any critical failure. Ethan nodded again. Because the relay hardware was still working. It was simply out of alignment. The Queen glanced at the engineers surrounding the console. "And your solution," she said calmly to Ethan, "was to recalibrate the relay itself." Ethan rested his hand lightly on the edge of the console. "Machines like balance," he replied. Once the timing coil was reset, every ship automatically fell back into synchronization. The large holographic display flickered slightly as the system updated the relay data again. The signal graphs now showed perfectly aligned communication waves flowing through the network. One of the senior engineers stared at the display for several seconds before slowly nodding. "The correction is mathematically sound." Another engineer added quietly. "It is also remarkably simple." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Most good repairs are." The Queen watched the engineers carefully as they studied the restored signal network. Then she looked back at Ethan Carter with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was seeing something new for the first time. "You solved a fleet-wide communication failure by repairing a single transmitter coil," she said. Ethan gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Technically, it was the timing alignment. The Queen's golden eyes remained on him as the engineers around them continued examining the flawless signal graphs now flowing across the display. "Your explanation," she said slowly, "raises a very interesting question." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "What question is that?" The Queen regarded him calmly for a moment before replying. "Why did none of my engineers think to repair the relay station itself?" The question lingered in the command chamber like a quiet ripple through still water. Several Erixian engineers glanced at one another while the holographic signal display continued to glow steadily above the console. The restored communication waves moved through the network with perfect alignment, their smooth rhythm silently confirming the explanation Ethan Carter had just given. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the edge of the console and looked at the projection again before answering. "Because," he said calmly, "you were looking at the fleet instead of the relay." One of the senior engineers folded his arms more tightly. "The fleet was experiencing the malfunction." Ethan nodded. "Yes, that is where the symptoms appeared." He pointed again toward the signal graph drifting across the holographic panel. But the cause was somewhere else. The engineer studied the projection again with a thoughtful expression. Ethan continued, his voice relaxed and conversational, as if he were explaining a routine repair to a coworker back at the relay station. When machines are connected in a network, the failure rarely happens. Where people first notice it, signals travel through dozens of systems before reaching their destination. If one relay drifts slightly out of alignment, everything connected to it starts behaving strangely. One of the younger engineers leaned closer to the projection, studying the corrected phase lines more carefully. Our diagnostic teams assumed the fleet transmitters were degrading simultaneously. Ethan gave a small shrug. That would have been a much more complicated problem. The engineer slowly nodded. Yes, it would have been. The Queen remained silent beside Ethan, her attention focused entirely on the discussion unfolding around the console. The soft golden lights of the chamber reflected across her turquoise skin, while the signal display illuminated the room in shifting patterns of blue and silver. Ethan continued studying the holographic network map as if it were simply another piece of equipment waiting to be understood. Maintenance teaches you something important, he said quietly. One of the engineers glanced toward him. What is that? Ethan smiled slightly. Most machines are not actually broken. They are just misunderstood. A few of the engineers exchanged thoughtful looks at that. The senior engineer turned back to the display and began adjusting several diagnostic parameters. As the system recalculated the network simulation, the holographic projection clearly demonstrated the drift Ethan had described earlier. When the relay alignment shifted by only a few microseconds, the entire fleet communication grid slowly destabilized. When the relay timing was corrected, every signal returned to perfect synchronization. The engineer watched the simulation for several seconds before exhaling quietly. The solution truly was that simple. Ethan nodded. Simple repairs are usually the ones that get overlooked. The Queen finally stepped closer to the console again, her gaze moving from the restored network display to the human technician standing beside it. You approached the problem differently from my engineers, she said calmly. Ethan considered that for a moment before answering. Your engineers were trying to protect the fleet, he replied. I was trying to fix a machine. The Queen studied him for several seconds without speaking. Around them, the engineers continued examining the corrected data while the flagship's communication network operated flawlessly through the relay station Ethan had repaired earlier. Finally, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful and quiet. Ethan Carter, how long have humans been exploring interstellar engineering? Ethan leaned back slightly against the console while considering the question. Not very long compared to most civilizations, he said. We are still figuring things out. The Queen tilted her head slightly, as if examining a new idea. And yet a single human technician solved a problem my fleet could not. Ethan gave another small shrug. Sometimes it helps to look at the system from the outside. The Queen's golden eyes remained fixed on him as the signal display continued its steady glow. Then she said something that caused several nearby officers to glance up in surprise. I believe the Oryxian Empire would benefit from having someone with that perspective. The words hung in the air long enough for every engineer in the chamber to hear them clearly. Several officers looked toward the Queen with visible surprise, while the holographic network display continued to glow steadily above the console. Ethan Carter blinked once and shifted his weight slightly against the edge of the workstation. That sounds important, he said carefully. The Queen regarded him with calm interest, as if she had already considered the idea long before speaking it aloud. Perspective is a valuable resource, she said. Civilizations often become too familiar with their own systems. Ethan glanced toward the projection again, where the communication lines continued to flow perfectly through the relay network he had repaired earlier. The enormous flagship hummed quietly around them, its towers of signal arrays carrying messages between ships scattered across millions of miles of space. Your engineers are very good at what they do, Ethan replied. They just approached the problem from the inside. One of the senior engineers nodded slowly while studying the signal simulation still running across the holographic display. Our training focuses heavily on system optimization within the fleet, the engineer admitted. Ethan lifted one hand slightly toward the projection, which makes sense if the fleet is the center of your network. The Queen's golden eyes remained focused on him. But you approached the problem differently. Ethan shrugged. Maintenance engineers tend to think about systems as chains. When one link moves, everything connected to it changes. The Queen considered that explanation for several seconds before speaking again. You repaired the relay station in less than 10 minutes. Ethan tilted his head slightly. About 8 minutes if you do not count the time I spent arguing with the transmitter. A few of the nearby engineers allowed themselves small smiles at that comment. The tension in the room had slowly shifted into something closer to curiosity and respect. The Queen stepped closer to the central console where the signal graph floated in the air like a quiet constellation. "Ethan Carter," she said calmly, "how long did it take you to learn this approach to engineering?" Ethan thought about that question for a moment before answering. "Probably most of my life," he said. "Humans grow up fixing things. Cars, radios, broken kitchen appliances. When something stops working, we usually take it apart to see why." The engineers exchanged thoughtful looks at that. One of them spoke quietly. "Oryxian systems are rarely opened without full diagnostic authorization." Ethan nodded. "That makes sense if the system is extremely complicated." The Queen studied him with increasing interest. "And yet you did not hesitate to open a transmitter connected to an Imperial fleet." Ethan smiled slightly. "It was already broken." The Queen's expression softened again with faint amusement before becoming thoughtful once more. She turned toward the large holographic display and watched the steady communication signals moving across the network for several seconds. Then she looked back at Ethan Carter. "You solved a fleet-wide problem using practical observation and experience rather than advanced analysis." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Sometimes the simple answer is hiding in plain sight." The Queen nodded slowly as if confirming a decision she had already reached. Around them, the engineers continued reviewing the flawless communication data, their earlier confusion gradually turning into quiet respect for the human technician standing beside them. Finally, the Queen spoke again, her voice calm but decisive. "Ethan Carter," she said, "I believe the Oryxian Empire could learn a great deal from that way of thinking." Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. "That sounds like the beginning of a job offer." The Queen regarded him for a moment before replying in a tone that caused several nearby officers to straighten immediately. "It may be something far more significant than that." The command chamber fell completely silent after the Queen spoke. Even the engineers studying the holographic communication grid paused their work as if they understood that something unusual had just happened. Ethan Carter stood beside the console with his tool case still resting near his feet, looking at the ruler of an interstellar empire with the same thoughtful expression he usually reserved for a stubborn piece of equipment that refused to behave. Around them, the flagship continued its steady hum, millions of signals flowing through the restored relay network and out across the vast formation of Oryxian ships surrounding the blue dwarf star. The holographic display glowed softly above the console, showing communication channels moving through space like streams of light. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "I am not sure I am qualified for anything significant," he said honestly. "I fixed transmitters." The Queen regarded him quietly for a moment before replying. "You restored communication for an entire fleet in minutes." Ethan gave a small shrug. "That transmitter just needed someone to open the panel." A few of the nearby engineers exchanged glances again, but none of them disagreed. The Queen stepped closer to the console and studied the signal display one last time before turning toward the assembled officers and engineers. Her voice remained calm, but it carried the quiet authority that had commanded fleets and worlds for generations. "The relay network is stable again," she said. "Our ships are fully synchronized." Several officers nodded in confirmation. The Queen then turned back toward Ethan Carter. "And the individual responsible for that stability stands here." Ethan shifted slightly under the attention of half the room. "Technically, it was just a timing coil," he said. The Queen allowed the faintest hint of a smile before continuing. "Perhaps, but the principle behind that repair is more important than the part itself." She paused briefly, her golden eyes moving across the chamber. Complex civilizations often search for complex answers. Yet today a simple observation restored the entire network. The engineers around the console listened carefully. The lesson was clear even if none of them said it aloud. The Queen returned her attention to Ethan. "Your perspective is rare," she said quietly. "You look at systems without the assumptions that limit others." Ethan thought about that for a moment before replying. "Machines do not care who fixes them," he said. "They just want to work." The Queen studied him again as if measuring the meaning behind that statement. Then she spoke words that caused several officers to straighten immediately. "Ethan Carter, beginning today you will serve as an independent technical advisor to the Oryxian fleet." Ethan blinked once. "That is a much larger maintenance contract than I expected." A few of the engineers could not hide their smiles. The Queen's expression softened slightly as she continued. "Your role will be simple. When our systems behave in ways we do not understand, you will remind us to look at them differently." Ethan glanced toward the enormous holographic map of the fleet, then toward the distant relay station orbiting far outside the flagship. Finally, he looked back at the Queen. "I suppose I can do that," he said calmly. The Queen nodded once, satisfied. Beyond the massive windows of the flagship, hundreds of ships continued drifting silently through the light of the distant star, their communication signals now flowing perfectly through the small transmitter a human technician had repaired with a wrench and a quiet understanding of how machines like to behave. And somewhere far out in the darkness of space, the relay station continued its steady work, humming softly as if it knew that sometimes the smallest repair could change the direction of an entire fleet.